As you know, the Blacksburg Museum is dedicated to establishing a sense of place and time for visitors to our community as well as our citizens, of course. And right now, we're working on the restoration of 2 historic buildings, as well as the collection of artifacts. But I think I can speak for many of us from the museum when I say that we are very aware that our community's history and its identity is formed in part by its cultural institutions and, of course, its artistic productions. The Blacksburg Museum will be featuring the works of regional and local artists, and we certainly hope to put them into a larger historical context. At the same time, I think this art can really help us to understand our own history, and we'll see that a little bit tonight at Smithfield. So the discipline of art history from which I am from is based on the idea that you can really understand a work of art better by understanding the social and the historical context in which it was created. At the same time, I think that history can be represented and even enhanced by studying works of art. And we're going to look a little bit at Smithfield's pieces tonight. What you might not realize when you walk into Smithfield with all that it has to impress its visitors is that the portraits in Smithfield actually represent a nice overview of American portraiture in the 18th and then in the early 19th century. The copies, the original artworks, the works on loan there represent some of the finest artists of the period, as well as characteristics of American art that we'll see. Now, I'm going to talk about several portraits at Smithfield, though it's impossible to talk about all of them. But we're going to concentrate on the gentleman here that you see. This is James Paton Preston, the 4th son of Colonel William Preston and Susanna Smith. And he's probably best known as the governor of Virginia from 1816 to 1819. This is a portrait by Gilbert Stuart, perhaps the most prominent artist in America in the early 19th century. And this is actually the original, done in 1803. It's now at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Smithfield has a 1980 copy that's on display in the drawing room. Now, I have to kind of note, I went to Richmond to look at this painting. I had the pleasure of making them pull it out of storage for me. And this is unfortunately a very poor reproduction of it. The picture that they gave me is very dark. When you see this picture in person, you can actually see a lot more in the background. You can also see quite a bit more of his body. It's not so much of a floating head thing that you see here. And unfortunately, those things in the background are important to interpreting the piece. So later on when I talk about it, I'll try to tell you a little bit about what's back there, and hopefully we can get this painting down here to look at in person. However, before we take a look at the pieces at Smithfield, we need to understand a little bit the history and the function of portraiture in general, and then in 18th and 19th century America in particular. Some of the most recognizable images in the history of art are, of course, portraits, and many of them transcend their roles as being just physical likenesses of an individual. They can tell us a little bit about the social position or the profession of the person represented. They can tell us about the style and the tradition in which the artist worked. And they can also tell us about the society in which the painting was produced. And I'm showing you here, of course, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. And then on the right-hand side, a portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. We are going to see Washington over and over again in Stuart's work, and later on in the lecture as well. Now, perhaps the most important thing to understand about portraits is that they are public images, even within a domestic setting like Smithfield. They are meant to be seen, interpreted, and appreciated by a group of people. And because they work in this sort of public domain, they can actually be employed to send a specific message to the viewer or to imply a particular meaning or an impression about the sitter. And this is very important as we look at that picture of James Paton Preston, and certainly the work of all the artists that we're going to see tonight. And throughout the history of portraiture, artists have used the works to make a particular point. In ancient Greece and Rome, portraits of leaders were put on things such as currency, like you see on the left-hand side, making a leader's image almost omnipresent and certainly reinforcing their power. On the right-hand side, you see an image of the Emperor Augustus, and statues like this were put in civic spaces throughout ancient Rome, and they certainly commemorated the individual as well as sort of connecting them with the many statues of gods that you would see in these Roman cities. In medieval Europe, portraiture became a very important part of tomb sculpture. It commemorated the life of the deceased as well as gave the living an example of a sort of exemplary life. In the Renaissance, one of my favorite periods, the dead were depicted with the living, and patrons went so far as to depict themselves in biblical stories. This is a fresco in the Tornabuoni Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence by Domenico Ghirlandaio, and this depicts the biblical story of the birth of the Virgin. Now you'll see on the left-hand side there's this sort of group of young ladies. This is actually ladies from the Tornabuoni family, particularly this young woman right here. So this is a portrait of her as if she were part of the biblical story. And certainly this gives us an idea of the power of this family as well as their piety. One of the most interesting things, one of the most interesting uses, I guess, of portraiture through time has been used by the elite. Portraiture has largely been the privilege of the elite. And so you have monarchs who use portraiture to show their familial ties, to also promote their power. You see this wonderful portrait on the left-hand side of Elizabeth I, who is literally standing on her kingdom. You also see leaders depicted in armor quite often to commemorate a particular military campaign and, of course, to demonstrate their valor. The use of these images as sort of images of power and politics we can even see in American art. Now, portraiture in America was largely taken from French and English examples, and I'm showing you a couple examples here of how the aristocracy and, of course, our different leaders in Europe used images to give a particular impression of themselves. One of my favorites is the picture on the right of Napoleon, which is a not-so-subtle message of his power as emperor at that time. And certainly our American artists of this period were looking at French examples. Portraiture in America in the 18th and the early 19th centuries, however, embodied many of our fledgling nation's values and their ambitions, as well as our society's close connection to British culture. From the furnishings in American homes to proper manners and social customs, America looked to England as its prime example, even as it sought independence from British control. In the arts in particular, prominent British artists like Sir Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough were the examples against which American artists were measured. While artists trained in America experienced moderate success, those artists who traveled to Europe and particularly to England to study art had the most success both in Europe as well as in America. The Georgian era of portraiture in England from about 1714 to 1830 is the period from which most of our prominent American artists came from, and it was centered in London at this time. It was where men like Reynolds and Gainsborough had a steady stream of patrons from the aristocracy and, of course, from the ruling classes. At the same time, the Royal Academy was founded in London in 1768. This was an artist society that was led by Reynolds, and it consisted of classes of instruction as well as exhibition opportunities. But most importantly, it established the public's taste in art, and in particular, it promoted the idea of looking back to Greek and Roman examples of art. And this is also extremely important because the members of the Royal Academy, as well as the different activities that they promoted, had a tremendous influence on the development of American art and, of course, American artists. Furthermore, artists that America actually claims as its own had their most success actually in England. And in particular, I want to mention Benjamin West and John Singleton Copley. While they're considered prominent American artists, they actually had greater success in England than they did here in America. And that was in part because men like Reynolds and Gainsborough had sort of established a culture in London of art appreciation, certainly. One of the things I want to point out just in these two images as well that we'll see in some American examples is that these British artists tended to set their patrons in these kind of elaborate sort of dramatic settings. On the right-hand side, it's sort of an interior setting that she's in. And on the left, Lord Heathfield is in front of this sort of tumultuous storm. And you'll see this quite a bit in American art as well. So I mentioned that Benjamin West and John Singleton Copley were two American artists who had a great deal of success in England, but they also had a tremendous influence on the development of American art. These are actually images by Gilbert Stuart of these two prominent artists. He did a series of portraits of these artists that were later printed. And I want to start with Benjamin West. His influence on American painting is quite simply enormous. He was born in Springfield, Pennsylvania in 1738. He showed an early talent for painting and eventually sailed to Italy, where he studied the works of Roman and Renaissance masters. He settled in London in 1763 and became a charter member of the Royal Academy, which I mentioned earlier. He also later became King George's official historical painter. And I want to mention at this time as well that portrait artists were not sort of in the top ranks of artists. History painting was considered to be the ideal form of painting, and portraiture was just a way to make a living. And so even as artists went through the Royal Academy and studied with these various masters, they were encouraged to do historical paintings, paintings also of ancient Greek myths and not necessarily of portraits. But as Gilbert Stuart would point out later, portraits paid the bills, so we see some wonderful portraits from all of these artists. At King George's court, West appropriated the styles of many of his English colleagues, as well as creating his own distinct style. But his greatest legacy is actually the students that went through his studio. West was known to never deny any American who came to his studio in London the opportunity to work with him. So artists like Charles Willson Peale, Gilbert Stuart, John Trumbull, and Samuel F.B. Morse, many of which are represented in Smithfield's collection, all went through Benjamin West's studio at one time or another. And I just want to show you here very quickly, this is perhaps the most famous painting by Benjamin West. It is a historical painting, which is what he tried to do most often. And this is The Death of General Wolfe. One thing I want to point out about West is that even though he did these historical paintings, the individuals that you see in there are based on this kind of portrait idea. And that was something that English artists weren't particularly interested in for historical portraits, but West certainly was. John Singleton Copley painted many of America's elite, becoming the supreme artist of the American colonies by 1760. Copley's style was often criticized by his British counterparts for being too plastic with too many outlines. Nonetheless, Copley's work in both America and after 1774 in England was notable for his ability to craft the image of the sitter the way he or she wanted to be seen, rather than necessarily how they actually looked. And this is an important component to understand about portraiture in general, and certainly about the portraits of Copley and later of Gilbert Stuart. Using gestures, props, and costume familiar to the American viewer, Copley's paintings became visual indications of social status. He faithfully depicted the sitter's appearance while at the same time constructing meaning through the depiction of expensive fabrics or elaborate backgrounds. And this portrait of Nicholas Boylston is particularly interesting, not only because it shows the type of fabric that Mr. Boylston could afford, but it also shows John Singleton Copley's ability to then render it in paint. So it's a particularly impressive image. Copley, like many American artists, relied heavily on prints of works by Reynolds and others that were available in the colonies for the latest fashions in Europe. And Copley, along with many of his contemporaries, set the stage for artists like Gilbert Stuart by following English examples and yet at the same time adapting those examples for Americans. And that becomes particularly important for Stuart. With the Revolutionary War and the subsequent formation of America's democratic government, portraiture underwent a distinct evolution in America. Led by Gilbert Stuart, artists adapted European traditions of aristocratic portraiture to depict prominent revolutionaries like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and George Washington. I'm going to show you here some of the most famous paintings by Gilbert Stuart, even though they are unfinished. These are the so-called Athenian portraits of Martha and George Washington. There are many, many copies of these that Stuart did himself, as well as other artists, and those forms were taken from these original unfinished paintings. Instead of focusing on the depiction of wealth and social differences, the portrayal of prominent American statesmen was used to reinforce America's new identity, with an emphasis on wisdom, quiet strength, and most importantly, the principles of democracy. And it is within this context that I want to look at the portraits at Smithfield, and certainly that image of James Paton Preston. Smithfield displays portraits from multiple time periods featuring the many family members of the Preston family. And these examples come from periods both before and after the Revolutionary War and illustrate some of the major characteristics of American portraiture. And I want to start with the portrait that you see on the right-hand side in the back corner. This is a portrait of Susanna Smith Preston, and this is actually a copy by Charles Xavier Harris of an original by Jeremiah Thues, who probably did the original portrait in the late 1750s or 1760s. And it is, of course, on display in the drawing room. Jeremiah Thues emigrated from Switzerland in 1735 and was the premier portrait artist in Charleston, South Carolina, from about 1740 until roughly the late 1760s. Thues painted nearly 150 portraits, most featuring prominent citizens from Charleston, but he also painted landscapes, crests, and coats of arms. He even advertised his services in the local newspaper. His work is representative of a larger trend in portraiture during the colonial period, where artists, rather than emphasizing the sort of facial and physical appearance of the sitter, instead were interested in costume, in particular in things like lace and bows and the dress that you would see here on Susanna. And for Thues in particular, many of his faces, particularly of the female sitters, then ended up being relatively similar. Like many American artists of the time, he relied heavily on English mezzotint prints and engravings imported to America for his poses and his costumes. London printmakers would publish prints based on painted images of prominent members of the aristocracy. And Thues and his contemporaries would then closely study these examples so as to place their American sitters in similar poses and similar costumes. And we may guess then from that tradition that the dress that Susanna is in was probably not actually her own dress. It was probably taken from a print example. And let me show you just a great example to illustrate this. On the left-hand side, you see a portrait of Mary Finch, Viscountess of Andover, by John Faber after a 1746 portrait by Thomas Hudson. On the right-hand side is a portrait by John Singleton Copley, and as you can see very clearly, he has simply copied the background and the costume for his American sitter. Interestingly, there is another portrait by Copley of another woman in the same exact pose, in the same exact background. So clearly you can see that he really was just adapting straight from the print. And oftentimes artists would have sittings with a particular patron and just paint their faces, and then would go back in and do the body much later on, and this would be an example of that. Moving chronologically, one of the next portraits on display at Smithfield to examine is this copy of a portrait of George Washington by Charles Willson Peale, and it's on display in the schoolroom. You can see over the mantel there. The original is entitled George Washington in the uniform of a British colonial colonel. It was painted at Mount Vernon in 1772 and is now in the collection of Washington and Lee University. Charles Willson Peale began his career as a painter in the 1760s by studying the works of other artists, including John Singleton Copley. Peale studied with Benjamin West in his London studio for 2 years, but he came back to America with the express purpose of painting heroes of the Revolutionary War and of America. This portrait, painted in 1772, depicts Washington as he would have appeared in the 1750s, as a British colonial colonel in the Virginia Regiment. He carries an American hunting gun along with an English-made sword, and his pose has his right hand sort of sticking into his vest. This was a pose that was considered appropriate for a gentleman. I also want to point out that during this time, many gentlemen were depicted with rather large bellies, and this was actually an indication that you could afford very fine food to feed yourself and, of course, your family. Peale would go on to do many additional portraits of George Washington as a revolutionary hero, depicting him in particular at the Battle of Princeton and also at the Battle of Trenton. And he used something characteristic of both European and American art, which is to kind of put your sitter in a recognizable setting. You might be able to actually recognize which battle is behind him. He's also displayed with particular props, so it lets you know a little something about the sitter in particular. By 1782, Peale had dreamed of creating a gallery of great men like Washington and painting the heroes of the Revolutionary War and later of the new American democracy. In addition to portraits, it's worth noting that Peale created a museum of natural history in Philadelphia, and in 1805 he started the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, which is still in existence today. The painting on the right-hand side is a self-portrait of Peale, and in the background you can see kind of the rows of portraits, which would have been sort of his gallery of great men. And then there's all sorts of these very peculiar things in the foreground, and that's images of objects from his Museum of Natural History, including the bones of a mastodon. Also associated with Charles Willson Peale is a portrait of Major William Preston, Jr., the third son of William and Susanna. This is a 20th century copy of a miniature that's possibly by Charles Willson Peale. Similar to his portraits of Washington, William Preston is depicted in his military attire, and he had a distinguished military career. He then later moved to Kentucky in 1814 and settled on land belonging to his father. This work is based on a portrait miniature, which is a tradition in America which, like full-size portraits, took quite a bit from English examples, and I'm showing you two miniatures here. Miniatures are painted normally in watercolor on ivory, and then they were placed into lockets or bracelets and brooches. So they became both jewelry and then these sort of very intimate images. Many of our most prominent artists who did full-size portraits also did portrait miniatures, and you can see Charles Willson Peale and Jeremiah Thus represented here. John Singleton Copley also did many of them. Now, the next portraits chronologically would be those by Gilbert Stuart, but we're going to skip those momentarily and move to the entrance hall, where we have a portrait of Senator William Campbell Preston by Samuel F.B. Morse. Morse is probably best known for his invention of the telegraph and not his career as a painter. But he was born near Boston in 1791 and studied painting in England at the Royal Academy under Benjamin West before moving to New York City in 1825. He attempted to seek commissions in historical painting, which was still considered the best type of painting to do, but instead had a relatively limited career in portrait painting. His largest contribution to the arts was the founding of the National Academy of Design in 1826. This was an honorary association of artists that had a museum and a school of fine arts, and it is still in existence in Manhattan today. William Campbell Preston was the son of General Francis Preston and Sarah Buchanan Campbell Preston. He studied law both in the United States and abroad and served as Senator of South Carolina from 1833 to 1842. He was a staunch advocate of slavery and vehemently opposed to any policies of President Andrew Jackson. And he's perhaps most celebrated as a great orator. And even, I think, in the portrait you can see here, he sort of looks like this confident gentleman, certainly would be an excellent speaker. So we have looked a little bit at the history and function of portraiture in general, and then, of course, in colonial and early America. We've looked at some of the portraits in Smithfield that demonstrate particular characteristics of American art, including its reliance on British examples, the use of props to give information about the sitter, and we've also looked at a lot of the artists who really exemplify these trends. I don't want to imply that Gilbert Stuart is in some way the best of these artists. However, I think that Stuart's work, particularly in representing statesmen, has had an amazing influence on American art and is really the more important way to start looking at that James Paton Preston portrait. So we'll look a little bit at Gilbert Stuart. And this is a self-portrait that Stuart did while he was in Benjamin West's studio in London. Gilbert Stuart was an extremely prolific artist, painting roughly 1,000 portraits that we know of, from the late 1760s until his death in 1828. While he produced some of the most celebrated portraits in America's history, his career is in general considered to be uneven and even tumultuous. Two scholars have actually suggested that he suffered from manic depression, going in and out of periods of depression and procrastination into periods of intense and rapid production. For Stuart, portraiture and storytelling went hand in hand. Rather than asking his sitters to sort of stand still so he could paint them, he carried on lively conversations with his subjects. And many of America's most prominent leaders who hated sitting for portraits had no problem sitting for Stuart, in particular John Adams and George Washington. Of sitting for Stuart, John Adams said, "I should like to sit to Stuart from the 1st of January to the last of December, for he lets me do as I please and keeps me constantly amused by his conversation." And here are a couple portraits of John Adams. The portrait on the right-hand side, one of Gilbert Stuart's most accomplished portraits, I think, is a portrait that John Quincy Adams commissioned from him. He wanted to capture his father near the end of his life, and John Adams is about 90 here. Despite his sociable character, Stuart was a great frustration to many, always suffering from deep debt and running from his creditors. He was a terrible procrastinator and kept many of his sitters waiting for years to get their portraits. He even went so far as to collect a 50% advanced payment on portraits with no intention whatsoever of completing them. He kept Thomas Jefferson waiting 15 years for one of his portraits. And I'm referring to the portrait on the left-hand side, the so-called Edgehill portrait. When the assumed original portrait from 1805 arrived in Thomas Jefferson's home in 1821, his daughter Martha looked at it and noticed that the paint was still fresh, thinking, of course, that it was a replica, and Stuart had decided to keep the original. Nonetheless, Stuart also did this medallion portrait on the right-hand side for Jefferson, which Jefferson did get relatively quickly. And Jefferson and his family considered this to be the best portrait ever done of him. And it is now jointly owned by Monticello and the National Portrait Gallery. Now, born in Newport, Rhode Island, to Scottish immigrants, Gilbert Stuart showed an early interest in both painting and in music, but he showed little ambition towards any profession until he arrived in Benjamin West's studio in London. There he both emulated and criticized his teacher and studied closely the work of British masters. As he exhibited his work, Stuart was praised for his ability to combine a faithful likeness with the representation of character. A 1787 article in a London newspaper said of Stuart, "Stuart dives deep into mind and brings up with him a conspicuous draft of character and characteristic thought." Stuart would be singled out throughout his career for his ability to represent one's character and even their soul. Upon his death in 1828, artists from Philadelphia issued a testimonial memorializing Stuart. They wrote, "His business was to counterfeit the soul. A glance at his copy was sufficient to afford an understanding of the original." In London and later in Dublin, Stuart experienced considerable success. Yet he thought constantly of returning to America to paint the new American president. I'm showing you on the left-hand side a portrait from his period in London. This is a portrait of Sir Joshua Reynolds. On the right-hand side is a portrait that he did in Dublin of John Fitzgibbon. As I said, he was constantly really looking across the ocean to America and not as much interested in his London and Dublin patrons. He said of his aspirations to go to America, "When I can net a sum sufficient to take me to America, I shall be off to my native soil. There I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone." Political and social upheaval in Great Britain, combined with mounting debts to English and Irish creditors alike, expedited Stuart's trip to America. In March of 1793, he sailed to New York, where Chief Justice John Jay was quite simply the only person that Stuart knew who could get him established in America. Stuart had met John Jay and painted Jay in London, and then came to New York and painted him once again in 1794, and that's the image that you see here. Jay was able to introduce Stuart to many of his New York patrons, and he even wrote a letter of introduction for Stuart to President Washington in Philadelphia, which was at that time the capital of the United States from 1790 to 1800. With this letter in hand and a list of 32 patrons requesting 39 copies of a portrait of President Washington, Gilbert Stuart went to Philadelphia with the firm goal of painting Washington. And that he did, over and over and over again. And I'm showing you just a few of his portraits of Washington. The three portraits on the top that you see are what we call the Vaughan style of portrait. Washington actually sat for Stuart 3 distinct times, which produced 3 distinct sort of original paintings, and the copies were made from those. The first sitting was for John Vaughan, and that created the portrait on the far right that you see. And then, of course, many copies were made from that. The 3 portraits on the bottom are based on that Athenian portrait that we saw earlier, the unfinished portrait of Washington. He just used the head and then filled in as necessary for the rest of the copies. Now, Stuart painted 2 full-length portraits of Washington, and his most famous is the so-called Lansdowne Portrait, which was commissioned by Philadelphia merchant William Bingham as a gift to William Petty, the Marquis of Lansdowne. Washington is standing as if addressing an audience, and he is surrounded with emblems of his life and his presidency, and the original Lansdowne portrait is, of course, on the left. He is dressed in a black velvet suit, the type of suit that he wore on public occasions, and the neoclassical decoration of the furniture is derived from the Great Seal of the United States. Under the table are books entitled General Orders, American Revolution, and the Constitution and Laws of the United States, while the books on the table are titled The Federalist and the Journal of Congress. So they're all referring, of course, to Washington's prestigious career. In addition to 2 painted copies of this particular portrait, it was engraved in 1800 by English printmaker James Heath. And one of these engravings is in the Smithfield collection, and it's on display in the drawing room, and I would certainly encourage you to go and take a close look at it. To say that Stuart was peeved about this print is an understatement, for he did not give James Heath the right to publish it. When the original portrait was sent to the Marquis de Lansdowne in Europe, Stuart contacted Benjamin West immediately and asked him to identify a London printmaker who could make engravings of this work, because Stuart did believe that he was going to make quite a bit of money off the publication of this print. Unfortunately, the Marquis de Lansdowne beat him to the punch, and he gave James Heath permission to produce the print without Stuart's consent, and certainly without even his knowledge. Stuart first came across the print quite by accident in a Philadelphia bookstore, and he went immediately to William Bingham, who had originally commissioned the portrait. William Bingham was less than helpful. So Stuart decided he was going to write a letter to Lord Lansdowne. He never actually sent this letter. But in the letter, he talks not only about how he's upset that he didn't receive any compensation, but also he thought that it was a rather mediocre print and that it did not do justice to the great painting that he had done. And in the letter, he writes to Lansdowne of this print, "Thus, without my privilege and participation, despoiled of the fair fruits of an important work, and defeated in the great object of my professional pursuit, your lordship will readily allow me the privilege to complain." And he did so in a rather long letter that he never actually sent, thankfully. Stuart's daughter, Jane, notes that this particular incident with the engraving troubled Stuart for the rest of his life. He was very, very upset about it. Yet despite this situation, Stuart received quite a few commissions from his portraits of Washington and certainly did quite well with those. He often worked on several at a time, creating a virtual assembly line of Washington portraits. And I think it's important to note, too, that many artists had workshops with apprentices who would help with the paintings. Stuart hardly ever used apprentices. He really liked to work on these paintings himself. He also concentrated mostly on the face of the portraits and then would put something in the background to finish it off if he had time. But I think he gained most of his joy out of doing the facial expression, and after that, he lost his interest in it. With the Washington portraits, Stuart solidified his reputation as the premier painter of prominent citizens and political figures in America in the early 19th century. He was praised not only for the strong physical likeness he presented of Washington, but for his ability to portray his sitter's character. Stuart firmly believed that one's outward appearance reflected their inner character, and while engaging his sitters in conversation, he sought a characteristic expression or an attitude that he could then use to portray not only the outward appearance, but also his sitter's soul. These portraits further demonstrate the long tradition of portraying leaders as the embodiment of their nation's driving principles. Here, Washington firmly holds the viewer's gaze. He seems to engage us, inspiring both confidence in his leadership and a sense of approachability. And that's a key point for American art. Many aristocratic portraits from England, the sitter seems to be looking almost past the viewer. In portraits like this one and in the James Paton Preston portrait, it seems as if they're looking directly at the viewer, and we're all on the same level with this individual. In Washington, they saw the personification of America's victory over the British and the promises of democracy. Americans and Europeans alike hungered for portraits of the great American revolutionary, and Stuart's images no doubt delivered. They came to define what we refer to as state portraiture, and they must inform our understanding of the James Paton Preston portrait. So let's finally get to that portrait. On the left-hand side, you see the 1803 original from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. On the right-hand side is a 1980 copy, and that is the one at Smithfield. James Paton Preston was the fourth son of William and Susanna, born June 21st, 1774, at Smithfield. His three older brothers, John, Francis, and William, each went on to prominent positions in government and the military, so it's not surprising that James pursued a similar path. He attended the College of William and Mary from 1794 to 1796 before spending a year in Philadelphia with his brother Francis Preston, who was a congressman at the time. And I do think that it's in Philadelphia that he probably came across Stuart, or at least some of Stuart's patrons. He returned to Blacksburg, however, by 1798 when he became one of the original trustees of the town of Blacksburg. By 1799, he was a justice of the Montgomery County Court, and he served in the General Assembly as a senator from 1801 to 1804. He later served in the War of 1812, in which he was wounded in the thigh, and that crippled him for life. From 1816 to 1819, of course, he was governor of Virginia, and he spent much of his time from 1816 to about 1837 in Richmond, but he still, of course, oversaw his affairs here at Smithfield, particularly after his mother's death in 1823. He died at Smithfield in 1843, and among his possessions were multiple slaves, furniture, livestock, and one painting valued at $1. It's impossible to know whether this painting that he refers to is the Stuart portrait, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that he would have had this portrait with him. He would have kept it in his possession until his death, when he split his possessions among his 4 children. Now, James Paton Preston was only 27 when this portrait was painted, and he was serving at the time in the Virginia state legislature. Newly established in his political career, it is not surprising that he would have wanted to commemorate this period in his life with a portrait by America's most prominent painter. Now, in the many portraits that we have seen by Stuart, and even some of his contemporaries, members of government are often depicted in a neoclassical setting, standing or seated in front of a column, often with a swag of drapery sort of billowing behind them. This neoclassical style, with its allusions to ancient Greece and Rome, was prominent in the late 18th and early 19th century as America identified with and emulated these ancient democratic societies. And of course, you can see an excellent example of this type in these images of Thomas Jefferson on the left and James Madison on the right. In some cases, however, the background imagery isn't as obvious, or Stuart just quite frankly, spends little time on the background if he looks at it at all. And you can see in the right-hand side this portrait of John Adams. He sort of is starting to work out the background and a little bit of the costume, but as I said, after he was done with the face, he was really not particularly interested in those things. And I'll note that patrons didn't really have much of a problem with this. I mean, certainly they wanted him to finish things, but I think the fact that they got it at all was really important to them. And then, of course, like I said, Stuart was the best. I mean, even people will admit they hate working with him, but he was just, quite frankly, the best portrait painter around. And if you wanted to be depicted, he was the person to paint you. Now, there's some similar things going on in the back of the James Paton Preston portrait. And once again, I'm sorry that you can't see it because it's just so great when you actually can. But on the left-hand side, behind him, there's sort of an undulating background that's reddish. It's a kind of a suggestion of drapery, as we've seen. In the background on the right-hand side, it's sort of the suggestion of a column. So certainly it fits within this tradition of state portraiture very firmly. You can also see quite a bit more of his suit and his wonderful puffy hair. So, unfortunately, I think we'll just have to try to get this painting down here to Smithfield so you all can take a look at it. At the same time, like his portraits of Washington, Gilbert Stuart tried to depict James Paton Preston's character in this. He gazes directly at the viewer, engaging us in a relationship. He certainly appears young, almost boyish, but his erect stature and his serious expression certainly suggest an air of confidence and dignity. And adopting the imagery of state portraits before him, James Paton Preston wanted to depict himself as sort of the personification of leadership, and I think he does that pretty well. We also have to remember that even in a private setting like Smithfield, this would have been a public image. Like the 20th century copy in Smithfield, it probably would have hung in the drawing room, which was a very public room, and it would have been seen by different visitors who were there. The Prestons would have been entertaining various people in that room. He also probably had it with him in Richmond. I wouldn't be surprised. His quiet and sort of proud demeanor would have kind of introduced him to his visitors as he wanted to be seen as a strong and fair leader and as a leader who in his profession was akin to many of the statesmen that we've seen before. Viewers probably would have been familiar with the Washington portraits, even those who lived in this area. Not only did they see many painted portraits, but of course many, many prints were made of those George Washington portraits. So I think they would have made the association with our various national leaders quite quickly. A later small oval portrait of James Paton Preston also hangs in the drawing room at Smithfield. Unlike the image of the young statesman that you see on the left, he has aged. He appears almost melancholy and, quite frankly, a little bit bored. Now, this could be just the artist's interpretation, but I think it provides an excellent contrast to the Gilbert Stuart portrait because you can really see how an image can give off a particular impression of an individual. And certainly it emphasizes the ability of the portraits in Smithfield to really tell us quite a bit about the Preston family. They allow us to develop a respect and an admiration for individuals that we don't know, but certainly we're striving to know. And I think at Smithfield, the portraits really help the interpretation of the site to let us know not only what their home was like, but maybe what they were like and how they wanted to be seen by the different viewers around them.